I didn't know my life was about to fracture over a pink princess dress and a lie told too easily. People think betrayal is loud, screaming matches, slammed doors, a moment where everything explodes and everyone knows who's wrong. But the kind that changes you forever is quieter. It sounds like a phone ringing 30 minutes before your 6-year-old daughter's birthday party. It looks like balloons half-tied, streamers still tangled on the floor, and a little girl in a glittery pink dress standing by the door, waiting for a father who promised he'd come. My ex-husband Paul said there was a family emergency. Again, I remember holding the phone to my ear, already knowing what he was going to say before he finished the sentence. My body reacted before my mind did. That cold drop in my stomach, that heaviness in my chest, the instinctive calculation of how I was going to explain this to a child who had been counting down the days on her fingers. Paul had promised. Not casually, not vaguely. He had promised our daughter, Faith, that he would be there. She asked me every single day for 2 weeks if Daddy was coming. She planned her entire birthday around him, helping with the balloons, seeing her cake, watching her blow out the candles. And now, 30 minutes before the party, he was telling me he couldn't make it because his sister had gone into labor. I stood in the community center, staring across the room at my daughter as she carefully lined up pink paper plates, humming to herself, completely unaware that her world was about to tilt. I said okay into the phone because there were children arriving any minute and I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. I knelt down in front of Faith and told her Daddy couldn't come after all. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just nodded, walked away from the door, and never looked back at it again. That moment broke something in me. Not just because he missed a birthday, but because I knew, deep down, that this wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a pattern, and I had been making excuses for it for years. What I didn't know yet was that this lie would unravel everything I thought I understood about my ex, about co-parenting, and about how far a grown man could go to protect his own comfort at the expense of his child. And I definitely didn't know that a few days later, a piece of security footage would force me to stop being patient and start fighting back. I'm 39 now, and if you'd met me 5 years ago, you would have described me as the woman who always kept things running. Not in an impressive boss lady kind of way. More in a quiet, invisible way, like the person who remembers the permission slips, the dentist appointments, the groceries that somehow disappear every 2 days, the birthday gifts for other kids in class, the extra set of clothes in the car because you never know when a spill will happen. I run a small marketing firm, mostly from home. It started as freelancing, late nights with a laptop and cold coffee, then grew into something real. Steady clients, a couple contractors, a schedule I shaped around school drop-offs and pickup lines. I built that life because I had to. Because motherhood doesn't pause when you're overwhelmed. Because bills don't wait for you to catch your breath. Faith is the center of everything. She's the kind of child who feels things deeply. She remembers tiny details, like the exact color of the ribbon on a present, or the name of a girl who was nice to her once on the playground. She's imaginative, dramatic in the cutest way, and she loves hard. When she loves you, it's complete, total trust. That's why watching her get disappointed by her father over and over felt like watching someone step on something fragile and pretend it wasn't cracking. Paul and I met 9 years ago at a charity fundraiser. It wasn't glamorous. We were volunteers setting up tables and decorations, me struggling with a box of centerpieces that was definitely heavier than it looked, him stepping in without being asked. "I've got it," he said, like it was automatic, like helping was his default. He smiled a lot back then. Not the polished, practiced smile people use at work. A real one. Warm, easy. The kind that makes you lower your guard without realizing it. We spent the night taping place cards, hanging string lights, laughing about how no one ever appreciates the behind-the-scenes people. And at the end of the night, when everyone else was leaving in little groups, he walked me to my car like it mattered. He had a steady job, accountant, the responsible kind. He talked about his family often. Sunday dinners, birthdays, everyone close enough to show up. It made him feel safe to me, stable, like a man who knew how to commit. He also said he wanted kids someday. Not in a casual maybe way. He said it like he was picturing it. We dated for about 1.5 years before we got married. I remember thinking it felt simple, not boring, just calm, like I wasn't constantly guessing where I stood. When I got pregnant with Faith a year after the wedding, Paul cried. I still remember it clearly, him sitting on the edge of the bed with the test in his hand, his eyes glossy, whispering, "We're really doing this." For a while, it felt like we were. The first years were what everyone calls normal: sleepless nights, constant laundry, conversations that got interrupted by baby cries, little arguments about who forgot to buy diapers. Paul worked long hours during tax season, and I adjusted my work so I could be home more. We didn't fight much. At the time, I thought that was a good sign. Now, looking back, I wonder if it was a warning, because we also didn't talk much. Not real talking. We lived in the same house and functioned like a team in the most mechanical way, like two people assigned the same project. Faith's needs came first. Bills got paid, dishes got done. TV went on at night like background noise to fill the silence. We became efficient. We became roommates. And I didn't realize how dangerous that was until 4 years ago, when Paul came home on a Tuesday like it was any other day and calmly told me he wanted a divorce. No buildup, no we need to talk for weeks. No counseling attempt, no visible crisis. Just a sentence that landed in the middle of my life like a brick. I want a divorce, he said. I remember staring at him, waiting for the rest of it, waiting for a reason that made sense. What happened? I asked. Is there someone else? He shook his head immediately. No, there's no one else. Then he said something I'll never forget because it felt like he was reading it off a script he'd rehearsed alone. I've been unhappy for over a year. I feel like we're roommates, not partners. I don't want to keep pretending. My mouth went dry. My hands actually started shaking, but I tucked them under my thighs like that would keep the world from noticing. So we work on it, I said. We go to counseling. We try. Paul didn't even hesitate. No, he said. I've made up my mind. The whole conversation took maybe 20 minutes. That's what still haunts me. 20 minutes to end a marriage that had taken years to build. 20 minutes, and then he went upstairs and started packing a bag. Faith was only 2. She was asleep, unaware that the shape of her childhood was being rewritten in a quiet house on a random weekday. We did the divorce through mediation. No huge legal war, no screaming in court. We split things down the middle. The custody arrangement seemed reasonable at the time. Faith stayed with me during the week because my schedule was more flexible. Paul had her every weekend, Friday evening to Sunday evening. He paid child support without complaints. His parents lived nearby and wanted regular time with Faith, and I supported that because they had always been kind to me. Even after the divorce, they treated me like I still mattered. That first year, Paul actually showed up every Friday at 6 o'clock, like clockwork. He'd arrive, sometimes with a small toy or a little treat. Faith would run to him with her arms wide. He'd scoop her up and spin her around, and I'd tell myself, okay, we can do this. We can make this work. Faith struggled, though. She didn't have words for what she was feeling, but I saw it in the way she clung to my leg when Paul arrived, in the way she'd ask, "Daddy house?" Like it was a question she didn't trust the answer to. I did what mothers do when they're trying to keep the world stable for their child. I smiled. I reassured. I said things like, "Daddy loves you," until the sentence felt like something I was chanting for myself as much as for her. For a while, it seemed like we were going to be one of those rare success stories. 2 adults who couldn't stay married but could still co-parent like decent human beings. Then, slowly the cracks started to show. At first it was small. A Friday afternoon call. "I'm running late. Can I pick her up Saturday morning instead?" Then, "Can we switch weekends? Something came up." Once a month became twice. Twice became routine. And every time he canceled, I was the one holding the emotional mess afterward, explaining to a little girl why the person she loved didn't show up again. Still, I tried to be understanding. He had a new position at his firm, more responsibilities, sometimes travel. That's what he told me. And for a long time, I wanted to believe him, because believing him was easier than facing what it would mean if I didn't. Because if he was lying, then it wasn't just about scheduling. It was about priorities. And I wasn't ready, back then, to admit where Faith landed on that list. By the time Faith turned 4, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Paul was still technically a weekend dad, but more and more, those weekends existed only on paper. Friday afternoons became negotiation hours. My phone would ring while I was finishing work emails or picking Faith up from preschool, and before I even answered, my body would tense. I started recognizing the rhythm of disappointment before it arrived. "Hey," Paul would say, his voice already apologetic. "I'm really sorry, but..." There was always a but. A client emergency, a flat tire. His brother needed help moving. His mom wasn't feeling well. Each excuse sounded reasonable on its own. That's the insidious part. If you line them up individually, none of them make you look cruel for accepting them. But stacked together, over months, they formed something ugly. A habit. Every time he canceled, I had to rearrange my life. Dinners with friends got postponed. A concert ticket I'd been excited about went unused. A work conference I'd planned around months in advance got skipped. I told myself it was fine, that this was what flexibility looked like when you had a child. Paul never seemed to notice the cost on my end, and Faith noticed everything. She'd ask on Thursday nights if Daddy was coming tomorrow. On Fridays, she'd sit by the window around 5:30, watching cars go by, announcing each one like it might be his. That one looks like Daddy's. When he canceled, I'd kneel down and tell her he couldn't make it this weekend, but he'd definitely come next time. I said definitely so often it started to lose meaning even to me. Faith didn't throw tantrums. She didn't scream or cry the way movies show disappointed kids. She just got quiet. She'd nod and go back to her toys, a little slower than before. She started asking fewer questions. That scared me more than tears ever could. About a year and a half before the birthday party, Paul called one Friday afternoon sounding panicked. "My mom fell," he said. "She hurt her hip. I need to take her to the emergency room. I won't be able to get Faith." I didn't question it. His parents had always been kind, especially his mother. Faith adored her grandmother. I told Faith that Grandma was hurt and Daddy needed to help her. Faith took it seriously. She sat at the table that night, drawing a get well card, carefully writing her name in shaky letters at the bottom. That Sunday, my friend Valeria texted me. She'd been downtown for dinner and sent a photo with no context. It took me a second to process what I was seeing. Paul, at a restaurant, with a young woman. They were sitting close, leaning in toward each other, laughing. Not coworkers, not a casual coffee. It looked like a date in every way that matters. My chest went tight. I called Paul immediately. "How's your mom?" I asked. He said she was fine, just a sprain, nothing serious. I asked if he'd been with her all weekend. "Mostly," he said. "Why?" I sent him the photo. The silence on the other end of the line was long enough to answer everything. At first, he said it wasn't what it looked like. Then he sighed and admitted it was a date. Saturday night. His mother had been fine by then, and he was allowed to have a personal life. I told him I didn't care who he dated. What I cared about was that he lied, that he used a fake emergencies to get out of spending time with his daughter. He got defensive immediately. "It's none of your business who I see," he snapped. "It is when you lie about it to skip your weekend," I said. He said he was getting older, that he wanted to find someone to settle down with eventually. That's when something in me cracked. "You divorced me," I reminded him, my voice shaking, "because you didn't want to be settled down." He hung up on me. After that, I told him we needed to stick to the custody schedule. If he had plans, he needed to arrange them around his parenting time, just like I did. He agreed reluctantly, and for a few months, things improved. He showed up. Faith relaxed again. She started packing her weekend bag with excitement instead of hesitation. His parents picked her up sometimes and took her to their house, and Faith loved it. She came back smelling like cookies and soap, talking about crafts and backyard games. I let myself believe we'd turned a corner. Then the cancellations started again. Different excuses, same result. By that point, I was tired. Not just physically, but emotionally exhausted from being the one who always absorbed the fallout. I threatened to go back to court more than once. Paul would apologize. He'd promise to do better. He'd say, "Do you really want to keep my daughter away from me?" And every time I backed down. Because he was right about one thing. Faith loved him. She had pictures of them at the zoo, at the park, building a snowman. Moments frozen in time. Proof that when Paul showed up, he could be a good father. What I didn't realize then was that I was clinging to those moments like evidence in a case I was afraid to win. Because admitting how bad it had gotten would mean admitting that love wasn't enough anymore. And that realization was still waiting for me, quietly, on the other side of a pink princess birthday party. Faith's 6th birthday was 2 weeks away, and she'd been talking about it nonstop. She didn't care about the cake or the presents, not really. What mattered was her daddy. She had spent days asking if he would be there, reminding me every morning about the princess dress she picked out, the pink balloons she'd imagined, and how excited she was to show him the cake. I called Paul 3 weeks before the party. I told him the date, the time, the details. The room had been rented, the face painter booked, the cake ordered. Everything was set. I asked him to promise me he'd be there, that it was important, that this was Faith's one big day. He promised. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," he said, sounding sincere. "I'll be there, I promise." I didn't know it then, but those words would haunt me. The day of the party, Faith could hardly contain herself. She was up at 6, running around in her new pink dress. the one she'd chosen because it had sparkles and princess written on the front. She kept asking when Daddy was coming, and I kept reassuring her that it was still a few hours before the party started. But she didn't hear me. She was already imagining what it would be like when Paul arrived. Around 1:30, my phone rang. I saw his name on the screen, and I swear my stomach dropped before I even answered. "Hey, it's Paul," he said, and I could already tell something was wrong. "I'm so sorry, but my sister Valeria, she's in labor. I need to take her to the hospital. There's no way I can make it to the party." My heart started to race. I stared at the decorations around me, the kids' laughter in the background as they arrived, the cake sitting untouched on the table. I looked at Faith, standing across the room, her eyes wide with excitement, waiting for her dad. "Paul, you promised," I said. My voice didn't even sound like mine, like someone who could keep it together. "I know," he said, his voice lower now, the apology thin and unconvincing. "But my sister needs me. I can't just not be there." I didn't respond immediately. I could feel Faith's eyes on me from across the room. I looked at her, standing there with the promise of the party in her hands, the anticipation in her every small movement. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to make the disappointment go away. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'll make it up to her next weekend, I swear." I hung up the phone without saying another word. Faith was standing by the door, her little hands resting on the frame, waiting for her father to walk through it. I didn't know how to break her heart. I went to her, knelt down, and told her that Daddy couldn't come after all. She didn't cry, she didn't shout. She just nodded quietly and walked away, her shoulders heavy as she went back to helping my mother with the decorations. The party went on. The kids came. They played games. They ate cake. Faith smiled when it was her turn to blow out the candles. She smiled when she opened her presents. But she kept glancing at the door, and I kept pretending that I didn't see it. I made excuses for Paul when other people asked where he was. I told them he'd been caught up with family things, that it couldn't be helped. I kept making excuses for him because, in my heart, I was still waiting for the man who had promised to show up. But it wasn't until the next day that I realized how deep the lie ran. That night, after everyone had gone home, after the cake was packed away, after Faith was tucked into bed, I thought of something that didn't sit right with me. I called Paul's sister, Valeria. I asked how she was doing. She paused before answering. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice confused. "I'm not pregnant. I had my tubes tied 2 years ago. What do you mean?" The phone felt like it was burning in my hand. My world tilted. Paul had lied. About her. About everything. I spent the next hour sitting in my living room, the weight of it all crashing down on me. I thought of Faith's wide, trusting eyes, of the way she had stood there, waiting for her father to show up. And then I realized I couldn't keep pretending, not anymore. I wasn't just angry, I was done being understanding, done making excuses for him. I called my lawyer first thing the next morning. I told her I wanted to file for full custody. I didn't need to justify it anymore. It wasn't about keeping Faith away from Paul, but it was about protecting her from a man who had chosen a date over his own daughter. I knew this was just the beginning of a fight, but it was the fight I had to have. The phone call to my lawyer was a blur. The words felt too big, too final, as though I was committing to something I couldn't take back. But I knew it was the right decision. Paul was not the man I thought he was, and the moment I realized that, everything changed. The world shifted on its axis, and I had no choice but to face the truth that had been building under the surface for years. When I hung up the phone, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a calm that didn't make sense in the chaos of what was happening. But it was there. I was tired, exhausted from pretending, from keeping up appearances, from making excuses for someone who couldn't even be there for his own child. But then came the guilt. What kind of mother was I, ready to take this fight to court over a missed birthday party? I asked myself over and over, had I really been that naive? Had I ignored the signs because I didn't want to see them? I spent the next few days replaying every moment, every time Paul canceled on us, every excuse that had seemed reasonable at the time, the sudden work emergencies, the trips he had to take, the endless lies that stacked up until I couldn't tell where the truth started and ended. I had missed it all, hadn't I? Hadn't I seen how it affected Faith? The quiet way she stopped asking where he was, the way she stopped expecting him to show up, like she was bracing herself for disappointment before it even arrived, the way she'd learned not to be disappointed. The thought cut deeper than I expected. And that's when I realized just how much damage had already been done. Not by one missed birthday, not by one lie, but by years of Paul failing to show up, emotionally and physically, when it mattered most. I was supposed to be her protector, her advocate, her mother. But how could I protect her from someone who was supposed to love her when I couldn't even see the lies until they were too big to ignore? I was angry, yes, but I was also confused. This wasn't the man I had married. The Paul I knew was responsible, dependable, someone who took pride in his family. How could this man be the same person who had stood in front of me, swearing his love, and then turned around to lie so easily? The anger didn't come all at once. It built up over time, piece by piece, like a crack in a mirror, slowly spreading until it shattered in my hands. But the shock of how deep the betrayal went, that was what cut me to the core. I tried to distract myself with work, with faith, with anything, but there was no escaping the truth. And then Paul called. It was late, maybe 2 days after I'd spoken to my lawyer. He was apologetic, even remorseful at first. He said he knew he had messed up. He said he would never miss another important event. Not for anyone. His voice sounded like the man I once knew. "I'm sorry," he said, pleading. "I messed up. I never should have let that happen. I'll do better, I promise." It was all so familiar, so predictable. But I was done with promises. I didn't trust him anymore. I didn't believe in the man who could look me in the eye and lie to my face. I had seen who he really was, and I couldn't unsee it. "Why did you lie?" I asked. "Why lie about your sister? Why use her as an excuse?" There was silence, a long pause. "I panicked," he finally admitted. "I didn't know how to say it. It was easier to tell you that." I couldn't bring myself to ask the next question, the one I was terrified to hear the answer to. What had he really been doing that night? I already knew the truth. But hearing him say it aloud would make it real. Too real. I told him then. Told him everything that had been building up inside me for so long. That his behavior wasn't just about missed weekends. It was about being unreliable, about choosing his own comfort over his daughter's well-being. I told him I was done making excuses. "We need to stick to the custody schedule," I said. "If you can't show up, then I'll have to go back to court. I'll protect Faith." There was no more negotiating, no more second chances. The trust was gone, and I wasn't about to keep giving him the benefit of the doubt. That was when things started to change. When the walls I'd built around my emotions started to crumble, and I realized how long I'd been living in denial. I wasn't just angry with Paul, I was angry at myself. Angry for thinking we could make it work despite the constant warning signs. Angry for not seeing the damage being done to my daughter, to me, to everything we once had. But I couldn't stay in that place of guilt for long. Because if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was this. I had to protect Faith. She couldn't carry this burden. It was mine to bear now. I wasn't going to let him hurt her anymore. The next morning, I called my lawyer again. I told her we needed to move forward with the custody modification. I didn't care how hard it would be. I didn't care about the cost or the fight. Faith deserved better, and I would make sure she got it. The days after I called my lawyer felt like I was stepping into a storm. I had made the decision to move forward, but now I had to face the consequences. Paul's reaction to my call wasn't surprising. He was angry, defensive, as though I had betrayed him, when in reality, he had already betrayed me and our daughter long ago. The first few weeks after that conversation felt like a delicate balance. Paul started showing up more consistently, as if he was trying to prove something, himself, I suppose. But it was too little, too late. His apologies became more frequent, his promises more grandiose. He began to talk about how he had been wrong and was going to change for Faith. I saw through the facade. The truth was that his behavior had not only damaged his relationship with me, but with his daughter as well. Faith may have been too young to fully understand, but she wasn't oblivious. I started to notice things I had ignored before, the way Paul tried to convince me that he was making an effort, but his actions never quite matched up. The texts that came through his phone while we were together, his face lighting up whenever he heard from his girlfriend Freya. I pretended not to notice. But I knew. Every time I asked him for clarity on something regarding Faith's weekend visits, he'd get defensive, acting like I was being controlling. He would remind me how Faith was fine with him, how she still loved him, and every time my heart would tighten because I knew that deep down, something had broken. Faith had stopped looking forward to his visits the way she used to. The excitement in her eyes had dimmed, and I could see it. I wasn't just watching the disintegration of my marriage. I was watching my daughter's relationship with her father unravel, piece by piece. A few weeks later, it was clear to me that we weren't going to be able to solve this with calm discussions or mediations. Paul's refusal to follow through, his selfishness in prioritizing his social life over his daughter's emotional needs, these weren't just mistakes. They were character traits. I realized he would never be the father Faith needed him to be. And then came the call from his parents. Paul's father, a man who had always been a source of support for me, called one evening. He asked if he could come over to talk. Of course, I agreed, but I had no idea what was coming. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Paul's mother spoke up, almost reluctantly. "We've been watching Paul lately," she said, her voice softer than I was used to hearing. "We know about the missed birthday party, and we're ashamed of his behavior." My stomach churned. Hearing this from them, hearing them admit what I had known all along, left me feeling strangely vindicated, yet deeply saddened. His parents were aware. They had seen the truth, and they didn't want to ignore it anymore. They told me they still loved their son, but they were embarrassed by his actions. They wanted to continue seeing Faith, no matter what happened with the custody battle. But they couldn't pretend they hadn't noticed the same thing I had. Paul was unreliable. "I'm sorry," his father said, his eyes steady but full of regret. "We're ashamed, and we want to help however we can. We're worried about him. We want you to know that you have our support." The sincerity in their words shook me. I'd always believed Paul's family was close-knit, and in a way, they had always been a buffer between Paul and me. But now they were pulling back, just as I was. They could see it, and they were willing to stand by me, not to protect their son's reputation, but to protect their granddaughter's future. It was bittersweet. The realization that I couldn't rely on Paul anymore came crashing down again. The man I had married, the man I thought could change, the man who promised his daughter he would be there, he wasn't who he appeared to be. Then came the text message that made everything feel even more real. "I need to talk to you," Paul wrote. "Can we meet?" The urgency in his message told me everything. He was scared, and I could see through it. This was his last attempt to keep some semblance of control before the legal process took its course. When we met in person, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were dark, his hair disheveled. The confident man I once knew was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he was on the edge of something. Regret, guilt, or maybe just the collapse of everything he had built to protect himself. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice strained. "I've messed up, and I know it, but I want to fix this. I want to show you I can do better for Faith." The words sounded rehearsed. He had said them before. The problem wasn't the apology, it was the pattern. The broken promises, the lies. And now I was expected to believe that one last "I'm sorry" would fix it all. "No, Paul," I replied, my voice steady but firm. "You can't fix this. You've had years to show us who you are, and we can't keep waiting for the man who might eventually come around. I'm not going to let you keep hurting Faith." The words felt final, and I didn't know what he expected me to say in return. He stayed silent for a long moment, his face flushed, his lips pressed tight. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he finally said, his voice low. I didn't realize how much I was losing, how much I was risking." "You've lost it already," I said, my chest tightening. "You don't get to choose when you're a father, Paul. You don't get to show up when it's convenient." I could see the walls go up around him. He'd shifted into defense mode, and it was clear that he couldn't comprehend the consequences of his actions. For the first time in years, I felt nothing for him. Not pity, not sympathy, just a quiet, painful understanding that we were done. When I left, the decision had been made. I was done negotiating. I was done hoping. The battle for custody was no longer about him. It was about Faith. It was about giving her a life that wasn't constantly disrupted by broken promises and lies. And I wasn't going to let him destroy her anymore. The days following my confrontation with Paul were harder than I expected. I had expected the guilt, that weight that presses down on you when you're making choices that hurt other people, even when they're necessary. I expected the anger, the frustration, and the endless spiral of how did we get here? I expected the heaviness in my chest that comes from feeling like I'm failing my daughter because of a man who couldn't be relied upon. But what I didn't expect was how isolated I would feel. I spent so many years trying to make it work with Paul. I had invested everything into believing he would come around. I had defended him against my family, against friends who saw the cracks I chose to ignore. I had convinced myself that things would get better, that we could co-parent, that we could find our rhythm again. But with every lie, every broken promise, every time I watched him fail Faith, it became clearer. This was the man Paul had chosen to be. And I was alone in this fight. The weight of it all felt like a shadow hanging over me. The realization that I had been living in a kind of fog for so long, clinging to a version of Paul that no longer existed, was painful. I wasn't just angry at him. I was angry at myself for ignoring the warning signs, for trying to keep a marriage alive that had been dead for years. The isolation cut deep. In the beginning, I had people to turn to, friends who called, who checked in, my parents who knew that this divorce was coming long before I did. But as the days went on, I started feeling the emptiness of it all. I started feeling the loneliness in the quiet moments, in the late nights when Faith was asleep, and all I could hear was the echo of my own thoughts. It wasn't just the divorce that was breaking me. It was the weight of being a single mother to a little girl who deserved better than this chaos. It was watching my daughter try to make sense of a world where her father was inconsistent and where promises had an expiration date. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't make it go away, and that made me feel powerless in a way I hadn't expected. At night, when I thought of Faith's 6-year-old face, the way she asked if Daddy was coming to the party, the way she smiled for everyone but kept glancing toward the door, I felt a raw, gnawing pain in my chest. The kind of pain that comes from knowing you can't undo the hurt someone else has caused. The kind of pain that keeps you up at night, questioning everything you've done up until this point. How could I let this happen? I kept telling myself that I was doing the right thing, that I was fighting for Faith's future, for a stable, loving environment. But in those quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, it didn't feel like enough. It didn't feel like a victory. It just felt like a battle I didn't want to fight anymore. I had fought so hard for so long, for a relationship, for a family that felt like it was falling apart, and now I was fighting again. But this time it wasn't for Paul, it was for Faith, it was for me. But that didn't stop the loneliness from seeping in. I thought back to when Paul first told me he wanted a divorce. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his decision. And I had been blindsided. The feeling of my heart being ripped out of my chest, the nausea of seeing everything I thought I knew about our life together crumble into dust. The truth was, I wasn't just grieving the end of my marriage. I was grieving the woman I used to be, the woman who believed that love could conquer everything. The woman who thought that the bond between a mother and father was something sacred and unbreakable. I was grieving the idea of family that I had held on to for so long, only to see it disintegrate in front of me. I had to let go of all of that. Let go of the illusions, the hopes, and the dreams that were never going to come true. And that was harder than anything else. But then, in the middle of the darkness, something shifted. I looked at Faith one morning as she held out a drawing she had made for me. Her face was filled with pride, and she smiled that smile that could light up the whole room. In that moment, I realized that I wasn't alone anymore. I had Faith, and Faith had me. I wasn't just fighting for her future, I was fighting for her present. For the mother she deserved, the stability she needed, and the love that was constant, even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. That was the turning point. I was no longer just reacting to Paul's betrayal. I was no longer just reacting to the pain. I was moving forward. But even as I made that decision, I knew there would still be moments when the weight of everything would threaten to crush me. The fear that I might fail her, the fear that I wasn't enough would always be there. But it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The path ahead was long, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. I had to be. And I wasn't going to let him win. The weeks that followed were filled with a strange mixture of determination and exhaustion. I threw myself into preparing for the custody battle with an intensity that surprised even me. My lawyer and I worked tirelessly, gathering all the evidence I needed to show that Paul wasn't just unreliable, he was actively choosing his personal life over his daughter's well-being. But it wasn't just the legal fight that weighed on me. It was the emotional toll of knowing what it would take to rebuild Faith's trust in her father. I had to protect her from the reality of Paul's actions, while also keeping her heart open to him, in the hope that, someday, he would be the father she deserved. I began to notice the little things, how Faith would ask, in the most innocent way, when Daddy would come for their weekend visits, her voice filled with that hopeful uncertainty. She wasn't angry, she wasn't resentful, but she was confused. I had to keep lying to her in small ways, telling her that Daddy would be there, that he loved her, that he was just busy. It killed me to do it, but I did it because I wanted to protect her innocence for just a little longer. She wasn't ready to see the truth about her father, and I wasn't ready to be the one to show it to her. But as much as I tried to shield her, I couldn't protect her from the weight of the situation forever. One day, a few weeks into the custody proceedings, Paul called. It was early in the morning, and I wasn't prepared for the conversation that followed. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Can we meet?" I hesitated, then agreed, meeting him at the coffee shop around the corner. The air between us felt tense, like a cord pulled too tight. When he arrived, he looked more disheveled than I'd seen him in years, his usual neat appearance replaced with unshaven stubble and tired eyes. There was no confidence in his step, no bravado, just the man who had lost his place in our lives. He sat down across from me, his hands trembling slightly as he fidgeted with his coffee cup. He wasn't the same man who had once confidently walked away from our marriage. Now there was an edge of vulnerability in him, an edge that made him appear less like the person I had loved, and more like someone who knew his time was running out. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," he started, looking at me for a moment before glancing away. "I know I've screwed up. I've hurt you, and I've hurt Faith. I don't want to lose her. I don't want to lose my chance to be a father." I could feel the walls around my heart start to soften. "Is this real?" my mind asked, as the part of me that wanted to believe in him, just for a moment, began to rise. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he continued, his voice low, "but I'm asking you to give me a chance to fix things. I want to be there for Faith. I want to show her that I can be the dad she deserves." For the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the turning point I had been waiting for, the moment when he finally got it. But then I remembered the countless lies, the missed weekends, the promises broken, the way he had shown up for Faith when it suited him and abandoned her when it didn't. "I don't trust you, Paul," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "You've lied to me too many times. You've made promises to her that you couldn't keep, and now you want me to believe that everything will change just because you say so?" He looked like he'd been slapped. His face went pale, his eyes wide as though he couldn't comprehend why I was saying the words that were hanging in the air between us. "I've changed," he insisted, his voice tight. "I know I've messed up, but I can change. For Faith. For you." I shook my head slowly. "You can't change the past, Paul. You can't change the way you've hurt her. You can't change the way you've hurt me. I'm not asking for perfection, but I am asking for consistency. For you to show up when you say you will. For you to keep your promises. And I need to see that first, before I can even consider giving you a chance to be part of her life again." He was silent for a moment, his expression pained, like he was swallowing something bitter. "I know I've failed her," he said quietly, "but I'm not going to give up. I'll do whatever it takes." It was the moment of truth, the moment where I had to decide if I was willing to allow him back into Faith's life. I thought of Faith's face, the way she smiled whenever she saw him, the way her eyes would light up when she talked about her daddy. I thought about her, and then I thought about me. Would I be able to live with myself if I kept the door closed on him forever? Was I too angry to give him the chance to make things right? Could I allow myself to hope again, despite everything? "I'm not doing this for you, Paul," I said quietly, locking eyes with him. "I'm doing this for Faith. She deserves a father who shows up, who doesn't just say he will, but actually does. If you can prove that to me, then maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to move forward. But it's going to take more than words." For the first time in years, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of the man I once knew. And for a moment, I thought maybe he was telling the truth. But then the cold reality hit me again. Trust wasn't something he could just buy back with a promise. Trust had to be earned. And Paul had a long way to go. The weeks following my conversation with Paul felt like walking a tightrope. On one side, there was the part of me that still wanted to believe that people could change, that maybe, just maybe, Paul could finally be the father he had promised to be. On the other side, there was the hard truth. The past was still with us. I didn't know how to let go of the years of disappointment, the broken trust, and the promises that had been made and forgotten. But I also knew that if I was going to move forward, if we were going to move forward, I had to stop fighting for what wasn't there and start fighting for what was. And what was there was Faith, her needs, her heart, her future. I began documenting everything. Paul's behavior, his excuses, his missed weekends, every conversation, every cancellation, every time he told me that something else had come up and he couldn't make it. The pattern was undeniable, but I was trying to be fair. I was trying to give him a chance to show up for his daughter without the weight of my past resentment holding him back. I thought that by the time the court date arrived, I would feel at peace, that the decision would be easier, that somehow Paul's attempts to make amends would bring the resolution I so desperately needed. But when the day of the court hearing came, nothing felt easier. It felt like a weight that pressed down on me with every step I took into that cold, sterile room. My lawyer, who had been a calm presence throughout all of this, was beside me, but the air was thick with tension. Paul was there too, looking like a man on the edge, unshaven, his clothes slightly rumpled, and a nervous energy radiating off him that I hadn't seen before. The mediator was professional, efficient. He sat behind his desk, flipping through papers as we all waited. He asked us to explain our concerns, to lay out our cases, and when Paul spoke, I couldn't help but notice the difference between the man I had married and the man sitting across the table from me. He was trying to be apologetic, but his words lacked conviction. "Look," Paul said, his voice hoarse, "I know I've messed up. I've made mistakes, and I know I've hurt her, hurt both of you, but I'm trying to do better. I've started showing up. I've kept my promises recently. I want to be the father she deserves. I'm not asking for everything to go back to the way it was before, but I want a chance to prove I can be reliable." I watched him speak, and for a moment I almost believed him. But the truth was, talking wasn't enough. His words couldn't erase the past, and it was painfully clear that he wasn't the father Faith needed. Not yet. Not until he could prove his commitment, consistently, over time. And as much as it hurt, I knew it had to be done. I spoke next, my voice steady but firm. "I'm not asking for perfection, but I'm asking for consistency. I've watched Paul cancel, lie, and prioritize his personal life over his daughter for too long. I can't keep letting him back in just because he says the right things. If I give him this chance, it's not just a fresh start for him, it's a gamble for Faith." I wasn't angry anymore. I was exhausted. Exhausted from fighting for a man who hadn't earned it. Exhausted from constantly questioning whether this time would be different. I was tired of hoping for someone who only showed up when it was convenient. I was ready to protect Faith, ready to set boundaries, to show her what it meant to have a parent who showed up, without excuses, without lies. The mediation lasted for hours, back and forth, questions about schedules, what would be best for Faith. Paul's lawyer fought for unsupervised visitation, but my lawyer made it clear that the conditions weren't met. Paul's parents, surprisingly, offered to back me up in court if necessary, agreeing that they'd witnessed Paul's behavior and had concerns about his ability to put Faith's needs first. By the end of the day, we had an agreement. I would have primary physical custody. Paul would get every other weekend with supervised visitation. No overnight stays yet. He had to prove he could stick to a consistent schedule before he could have unsupervised visits. Child support remained the same, and his parents could still visit Faith whenever I approved it. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a resolution. It was a compromise. And for the first time, I felt like it was the right one, because it wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't even about Paul. It was about giving Faith the space to grow without the confusion of broken promises hanging over her head. The fallout for Paul came quickly after that. The calls from his lawyer grew more frequent, his frustration palpable. He wasn't happy with the terms. He argued, he tried to negotiate, but the damage had already been done. When he tried to fight for more visitation, the judge looked at his history, the missed weekends, the lies, and made it clear that he wasn't getting unsupervised visits until he proved himself. That was the last time he tried to fight me on the custody terms. The real fallout came from within his own family. Paul's parents had been the ones to confront him about his behavior, and they made it clear they wouldn't side with him if it meant betraying their granddaughter's needs. It wasn't easy for them to turn against their son, but their loyalty to Faith won out. I didn't hear from Paul much after that. The calls slowed down. The texts stopped being frequent. He tried to reach out through Faith sometimes, but his attempts felt empty. And I realized then this was the end of it. The end of hoping. The end of waiting for him to change. And in its place was something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. I was no longer fighting Paul. I was fighting for Faith. And that made all the difference. The months that followed the custody agreement were both quiet and tumultuous in their own way. Quiet because, for the first time, my life felt stable again. The chaos that had been a constant undercurrent was finally silenced. I no longer had to brace myself for the phone calls, the last-minute cancellations, the emotional exhaustion that came from constantly wondering if Paul would show up. But there was also the internal storm, the one that raged inside me at night when Faith was asleep and all I had left was time and space to think. The echoes of the past, the missed promises, the lies, the what-ifs, they still lingered in the corners of my mind. But with each day that passed, those echoes faded, replaced by something stronger, something deeper. I had done the right thing. It wasn't easy. It was never going to be. But standing by my decision to protect Faith from the instability Paul had created felt like reclaiming my own life. And it wasn't just about fighting Paul anymore, it was about fighting for the future I could give Faith. And as I looked at her, this beautiful, strong little girl who had weathered so much more than anyone should have to at her age, I realized something important. She wasn't just my daughter, she was my greatest lesson. In her, I saw the quiet resilience that I had forgotten I possessed. I saw the way she handled the transition with grace, the way she still believed in the world, in love, in connection. She had hope, despite everything that had happened. And she didn't need to know the details of her father's failures. She didn't need to carry the weight of his lies. She needed to know that her mother would always be there, unwavering. That's the lesson I had learned the hard way. It's not about how many times you fall. It's about how you get back up for the ones you love. Faith still asks about her dad sometimes, and I answer honestly but gently. I tell her that he's trying to be better. I tell her that sometimes people make mistakes, but what matters most is how they move forward. I don't sugarcoat it. I don't twist the truth, but I also don't burden her with the full weight of the betrayal. She deserves to hold on to the innocence of childhood for a little while longer, and I will protect that for as long as I can. As for me, I'm learning to heal. Slowly but surely. I've started dating again. Not seriously, just casually. Dinner and movie dates with someone I met at work. I don't know where it will go. I don't even know if I'm ready for anything deeper yet. But for the first time in a long time, I'm learning how to take care of myself again. How to not feel guilty for taking time for me. And Faith, she's thriving. She's growing into the person I always knew she would be. Strong, kind, and full of life. She talks about her future with excitement. She dreams big, and I'm here to help her chase those dreams, no matter how big or small they may seem. The road ahead is still uncertain. There will be moments of doubt, moments when I wonder if I made the right call. But what I know for sure is that I will never stop fighting for her. She is the most important thing in my life. And as for Paul, I don't know if he'll ever change. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. But I'm not waiting for him anymore. I'm moving forward, one step at a time, for Faith's sake. In the end, the greatest lesson I learned wasn't about revenge or about winning a battle. It was about finding peace, about understanding that you don't have to hold on to the past to make room for the future, and that sometimes letting go is the only way to move forward. For Faith, for me, for the life we deserve. And that's enough.